With each passing generation, there will always be those games which push the limits of console hardware, and Team ICO's sophomore effort is no exception. With visuals that exceed what was thought possible on PlayStation 2, the spiritual successor to ICO shines brightly. But at what cost? Welcome to part 2 of our look back at the Ueda collection. This is Shadow of the Colossus. Following the success of ICO, development began on this game back in 2002 under the working title Nico. Based on early concept footage and interviews with the game's creator, it becomes clear that at one point multiplayer was being considered for this game. This demonstration reel was designed to visualize the basic concept of the game, and it shows 4 horned individuals attacking a Colossus on horseback. It's interesting to consider that this was first shared all the way back in 2003 and calls to mind a scenario in line with the popular Monster Hunter series or other hunting games in general, games which had not yet been released at this point. Ultimately though, while Ueda has maintained a fascination with multiplayer game design, it was eventually decided that Nico would become a single-player, story-driven experience. Early design documents suggest that Ueda had wanted to create 48 separate colossi, including optional encounters, before boiling things down to just 24. The team worked towards this goal during much of the project, but in the end, only 16 of these creatures would be included, a number focused on the colossi deemed most enjoyable to fight. By now the game's title was officially known as well, Shadow of the Colossus in the west and Wanda to Kyozo in the east. And as with ICO, many players' first experience with the game came in the form of a demo, a simple taste of what was to come. This demo features a chopped-down version of the open world and a single encounter with the Colossus. It set the stage beautifully, but also offered up a different challenge in the form of breaking the game world. This often shifting environment in which the game was developed led to a multitude of unfinished areas buried deep within the game world itself. In 2005, many of us spent countless hours poring over this world while uncovering areas which were either incomplete and absent from the demo, or never intended to be traversed at all. Finding the way up to the secret garden was one such accomplishment, a task that certainly required a lot of trial and error to get right. Of course, this was really just the beginning. Entire YouTube channels such as Nomad Colossus have continued diving deep into the game in an effort to uncover every last nugget of information. Shadow of the Colossus commands a dedication that few other games can match. At the tail end of 2005, Shadow of the Colossus would be released in North America and Japan to critical acclaim, with a European release following in early 2006. It's a beautiful game, but one not without issues. Yet despite these problems, there are techniques on display here which exceed what you might expect from the PlayStation 2. More than anything else, the first thing that really stands out here is the animation work. This is the key to selling the movements of its giant creatures. Consider this, the length of time necessary to swing a baseball bat in real life. It's pretty quick, right? Now look at the time it takes for this creature to swing his weapon. The way he shifts his weight and slowly swings his giant club towards the player is precisely what I'm talking about here. This extended length of time is precisely what gives these animations such a heavy look. This is all done with relatively few bones even, it's simply a case of smart animation design. This animation work is of course accentuated by the effects surrounding them. As each colossi slams into the ground, plumes of smoke and dust particles are generated around the point of contact, while a mesh is deployed to give the impression that the creature has actually broken the ground. Of course, Wonder and his horse animate much more quickly, as you can see here. The run cycle animation does look somewhat strange at points, but the horse animation is fantastic and very realistic. But what really impresses here is the reliance on real-time inverse kinematics calculations. IK is used in animation work in order to more realistically ground characters to a scene by adjusting the bone structure to match the placement of a specific limb. As Wander stands on a slope, for instance, his entire body shifts to compensate. This technique is what allows the Colossus fights to feel so impactful during gameplay. As you climb aboard and the giant begins to shake and sway, you can opt to hold on to the Colossus for dear life. Wonder's hand becomes the anchor point here, and animation is calculated based on this point. This is what allows the creature to violently fling your character around the scene. An extra touch of realism can also be found with the head tracking that's been implemented here. Each of the creatures will turn their gaze towards Wonder as long as they are aware of his presence. It's an effective but fairly simple technique here. Overall, it's the mix of smart animation design, which takes into account length of time, and real-time IK calculations are critical to the design and incredibly ambitious for the platform. Performing these calculations in real time on a PS2 at this scale is really impressive to behold. The world around the player also plays a key part in this presentation. One of the most impressive features then is the use of high dynamic range lighting, a technique which shares its name with the modern television technology but is really not the same thing. In Colossus, we're looking at a continuation of the high intensity bloom lighting found in ICO, but this time the team introduced eye adaptation and exposure into the mix. Essentially, the game is designed to simulate the intensity of light based on the position of the player character. When peering out from a dark room, outside light appears overexposed. Conversely, standing outside and looking into a dark room presents the opposite effect. HDR lighting was becoming popular during this era, of course, but the PS2 was really not equipped to deal with it, so the developers simply had to find another way. Essentially, the world is divided up into a series of trigger boxes, where lighting values are defined within each box. Using a Z-buffer mask, an image could be generated, blurred, and displayed in the appropriate location, giving the impression of a high-intensity bloom light effect. In order to smoothly transition between each box then, a short interval was implemented where the exposure will fade smoothly between the two zones, making it seem as if your eyes are adjusting to the change in brightness. So while the representation of bloom lighting on PS2 was nothing new, the way in which it dynamically adjusted on a per-scene basis certainly was. The downside of this technique lies in the fact that all of these trigger boxes had to be manually placed. Then we have the motion blur, something we often take for granted today, but the implementation here also stands out. Unlike most other PS2 titles, velocity is taken into account when presenting the effect. Camera and object blur are present as well, but both are handled rather differently. For the camera, the game actually tracks the velocity of said camera and introduces an accumulation blur based on the distance it moves. The end result is a very effective blurring technique that looks very smooth in motion, even when the frame rate drops to rather low levels. For characters and objects then, the game actually calculates the difference in bone positions during an animation and displays a polygon between them designed to represent blur. A texture based on the current frame is applied to this polygon, which helps give it the impression of real blur happening during fast motion. Next up are the shadows. Here we see a continuation of the work started in ICO, with the game using stencil shadow volumes for characters and colossi alike. The extruded shadows are once again masked and filtered in order to give the impression of soft shadows. The problem here is that the polygon models are more difficult to render using shadow volumes. While Wonder uses upwards of 3,000 triangles, the colossi can approach 20,000. The solution here is to extrude the shadows from a simplified model, which is invisible to the player. From the normal camera angle, it becomes difficult to spot the inconsistencies, and the end result looks rather convincing. With the size of the colossi, proper shadowing is important for maintaining a proper sense of depth in the scene, and it works well here. There is also some nice rim lighting in the game that helps situate the characters better within the world. Another clever trick can be found in the handling of fur. Fur shading as we know it wasn't really possible here, of course, since the PS2 does not have programmable pixel shaders, so the team sought to create a similar effect using texture layers instead. The fur is created from 3 to 6 layers of translucent polygons placed along the surface of the colossi itself. With textures disabled, you can see each layer here as it's placed. Notice how they appear darker as they are closer to the skin in order to provide a more natural shading. The parallax appearance of these layers helps give the effect a three-dimensional look that the team was going for. It really does feel as if the creatures have real hair and fur, something that was lacking in the prototype videos made prior to release, actually. Another key element in the game is data streaming. Shadow of the Colossus presents a large, albeit empty, environment for the player to explore, and all areas within the world can be reached without encountering a loading screen. Real-time data streaming had existed for a while at this point, but the complexity of the world and the massive view distances presented here were certainly challenging. In order to work around the PS2's limitations then, the team implemented a 3-tier system. Areas near the player are rendered at full quality, with all geometric detail in play. Medium distance objects then utilize a lower quality simplified mesh that places less of a strain on the system. Lastly, everything else in the far distance is rendered using a flat texture that is updated in real time. This texture is of course intentionally blurred, giving it a soft focus appearance designed to hide the fact that it is in fact flat. The game is able to transition between these 3 layers in real time, and in fact does so at almost all times. The transitions though can be pretty obvious at points, but it really was the only way possible to present a world of this size on PS2 without resorting to fog. All of these elements come together to form the game as a whole, and it's really quite amazing what has been achieved here. But all of this technology comes at a cost. Enter the frame rate. This is really the elephant in the room here. While I certainly enjoyed the game back in 2005, returning to it now, it's clear that the level of performance on display is, quite frankly, abysmal. Truth be told, it's one of the slowest running games on the PS2, I would guess. While the frame rate is technically unlocked, the game spends the majority of its time bouncing between 15 and 20 frames per second. Now fortunately the game is double buffered, so although the frame rate can drop to obscenely low levels, the frame persistence is at least relatively consistent. It's just really low. The motion blur technique was actually designed to help offset this problem by smoothing over the presentation, and it works pretty well actually, but there's only so much you can do when you're running at this frame rate. So why was the game released like this, you might ask? Well, obviously there's no official statement on this matter, of course, but I suspect that the core game is simply asking too much of the system. All of the animation work and collision systems necessary to make Shadow of the Colossus come to life are just too taxing for the PS2, and fixing the frame rate would mean abandoning the core design of the game. The basic concept of the game simply goes beyond what the PS2 could reasonably handle. It's a situation not unlike what would befall The Last Guardian, with behind closed doors footage reportedly running as low as 10 frames per second on PlayStation 3. The core of the game simply exceeded what could be done on that platform at a reasonable frame rate. Thankfully, there is a solution to this problem. In 2011, an HD remaster of the game was released alongside ICO by masters of the remaster, Bluepoint. As impressive as ICO was, I feel that Shadow of the Colossus stands as one of the best remasters ever released. The look of the game perfectly captures the visuals of the source material, but enhances it in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. Right out of the gate, you'll notice that image quality is hugely improved here. Jumping from a 512 by 448 progressive image on PlayStation 2 up to either a 960 by 1080 or 1280 by 720 mode, depending on what your console was set to, on PlayStation 3. For this video I'm using the 1080p mode, but it looks great in either mode, and using 720p does give you an ever so slightly smoother frame rate. Another great feature, which I unfortunately can't easily show here, is the inclusion of 3D support. So if you still have a television or some sort of a viewer like the HMZ T1 that supports 3D, you can play Shadow of the Colossus in 3D, and let me tell you, this is one of the best games for that feature. Now looking more closely at the visuals, you can see slight improvements to things like textures, in addition to real texture filtering. After all, the PS2 game lacks bitmaps of any sort, like most other games on the system really, so long flat surfaces now appear much cleaner on PlayStation 3. You've probably also noticed the difference in cutscene presentation. The framing is slightly different here, and more of the game is visible when displaying these scenes. PS2 uses more of a super wide mode when you're using the 16:9 gameplay mode, so you end up losing a little bit of the image. Another major improvement here though stems from the use of motion blur. On PlayStation 3, Bluepoint has implemented a modern per-pixel motion blur technique here. the type of blur that the original game was attempting to emulate in the first place. It is of course applied at all times, and it leads to a dramatically smoother looking game. This adds a lot to the presentation, I feel. But of course, that's not the only reason it feels smoother. The single biggest improvement here stems from, you guessed it, frame rate. The 15 to 20 frames per second experience on PlayStation 2 has been replaced with a near perfect 30 FPS on PS3. In 1080p mode, you might run into a few dips here and there, of course, but in general it's a very smooth game and light years beyond the original experience. This, more than anything else, helps Shadow of the Colossus finally reach its true potential. This is what remasters should be about, and this is definitely my preferred way to replay the game in modern times. But if you still only own a PS2 copy of the game, it is also possible to enjoy the game using PCSX2, just as I demonstrated with ICO last episode. It does work moderately well here with a higher overall frame rate than on PlayStation 2. Based on reading up on the game and my own experience with the emulator, however, the requirements here are rather high if you want to maintain 100% speed or better. Beyond that, the visuals themselves really aren't 100% accurate either, with things like the bloom lighting effect appearing overly strong at points. But really, it's still quite serviceable here, and it's an interesting way to explore the game. On the PC, it's easier to understand the way some of the effects work, and you really get a nice clean look at the game, especially when you bump up the resolution way beyond what you could do on a PS2, or even in the HD collection. It's definitely worth pulling out the emulator for this one. Still, if I had to recommend one way to enjoy the game today, I would say find a PlayStation 3 and a copy of the HD collection. It is clearly the optimal way to experience Shadow of the Colossus and its prequel, ICO. And experience it you should. Even now, this is one of the most unique games on the market, with some remarkable sequences that remain unmatched by any other game today. There is a reason why people were so eager to see the release of The Last Guardian. This was the game that boosted Ueda to the top. And while the years following the release of Shadow of the Colossus were certainly difficult for the team, I couldn't be happier that we now have a trilogy of very special games from this creative group. ICO, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian are all classic games that will live on for decades to come. And if you haven't given them a shot yet, and do appreciate a different approach to game design, I can't recommend them enough. But with that, we've come to the end of this episode, and in fact, this season of DF Retro. I've had a great time building this series this year, and have big plans for 2017. So thanks to everyone that has been watching these videos each time I manage to put one up on the site. In the meantime though, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter while you're at it. And until next year, stay retro. On the next episode of DF Retro.